The door was 8 feet underground. That hit me before the architecture did. Not a cellar door. Not a utility hatch. A front door. Framed. Decorated. Built to be seen from a street that no longer exists at that level. I was looking at a photograph taken during a routine utility excavation in a mid-sized American city, and the door was just there. Opening onto nothing but packed earth on one side and an intact interior on the other. And the caption beneath the photograph, filed in a municipal engineering report from 1961, said simply, "Anomalous structural remnant. Noted." Work continued. Work continued. Nobody asked why the front door was 8 feet down. Nobody pulled the thread. The pipes went in, the trench was filled, and the door went back to facing the dirt that had swallowed it decades or centuries before. That single caption is the most chilling thing I've read in months of research. Not because of what it found. Because of what it didn't ask. I found this while researching something else entirely. I was tracing the administrative history of basement classification codes, the dry, unglamorous question of how cities legally define what counts as a basement versus a sub-basement versus a cellar. It sounds like the least interesting research imaginable. But basement classification law changed dramatically in the mid to late 1800s across almost every major American and European city, and the reason given in the municipal codes is almost always the same. The city needed to formally redefine what constituted ground level because ground level had changed. Ground level had changed. Not, we are raising the grade. Not, we are undertaking an elevation project. Ground level had changed. Past tense. Passive construction. As if the change was something that had happened to the city rather than something the city had decided to do. That phrasing appears in the Chicago Municipal Code revisions of 1857. In the Portland, Oregon City Charter Amendments of 1871. In Edinburgh's Dean of Guild Court records from the 1820s. In a Sao Paulo urban planning document from 1893 that I found referenced in a Brazilian architectural history journal and spent 2 weeks trying to locate in full. The phrasing is not identical. The sentiment is. Something happened to ground level. The cities adapted. And the official record describes the adaptation without fully describing what necessitated it. The timeline isn't subtle. The official story goes like this. Urban ground levels rise naturally over time. Construction debris, demolition rubble, organic matter, wind-blown sediment, it all accumulates. A city occupied for several centuries will find its streets sitting measurably higher than they did when first laid out. This is not mysterious. Archaeologists rely on it. The principle of superposition, that newer layers sit above older ones, is the foundation of every excavation conducted in every inhabited place on Earth. Beyond natural accumulation, the official narrative also acknowledges deliberate grade raising. Chicago's famous grade-raising project of the 1850s and 1860s is the most cited American example. The city sat in a low-lying swampy plain, drainage was catastrophic, disease was rampant, and the solution was to raise the entire urban grade by several feet. Buildings were lifted on jackscrews. Streets were repaved at the new elevation. What had been ground floors became basements almost overnight. Let me be fair to the official narrative. This is documented. The engineering is real. The newspapers covered it in real time. George Pullman, later famous for his railroad cars, made part of his early fortune operating the jacking equipment. The Chicago grade raising is one of the genuine marvels of 19th-century civil engineering, and it has a clear paper trail. But here's what the official narrative doesn't explain. Chicago was not unique in its drainage problem. And the grade-raising projects that followed in city after city across the latter half of the 19th century were not all preceded by the kind of careful municipal deliberation that Chicago's project involved. In many cases, in Portland, in Sacramento, in sections of Philadelphia and Cincinnati and St. Louis, the grade-raising wasn't a project. It was a response. The ground had already changed. The cities were formalizing a new reality that already existed. What created that reality is the question that the official narrative skips past with remarkable consistency. Let's start with the numbers, because this is where the pattern becomes structural rather than anecdotal. Between 1840 and 1880, at least 23 major North American cities undertook formal street grade revisions. I'm working from a compilation I assembled from Municipal Engineering Archives, State Historical Society records, and a 1912 academic survey of American urban infrastructure published by the American Society of Civil Engineers, a document sitting in the ASCE's Historical Archive in Reston, Virginia that has been cited 4 times in the past century despite containing some of the most comprehensive data on 19th century grade changes ever assembled. 23 cities. 40 years. All formally revising what they considered street level. The official reasons vary: drainage here, sanitation there, flood response in another case, but the physical result is consistent. In each city, structures built before approximately 1820 are found, when excavated, to have their original ground floors at depths ranging from 4 to 14 feet below current street grade. 4 to 14 feet. That is not gradual accumulation. That is not the slow drift of debris across decades of ordinary urban life. 4 to 14 feet of material above an original ground floor, in cities that were actively occupied and administratively managed throughout the period in question, represents a specific event or series of events that deposited or necessitated a large volume of fill in a relatively compressed timeframe. Speaking of compressed timeframes, there is a detail in the Chicago record that I've never seen highlighted in popular accounts of the grade-raising project. The official start date of Chicago's grade elevation work is 1855. But the city's engineering reports from 1849 and 1850, held in the Chicago History Museum's research collection, already describe existing structures as having their lower floors partially submerged or at or below current water infiltration level. The problem that the 1855 project solved had been present, and worsening, for at least 5 years before the project began. What was happening to Chicago's grade between 1849 and 1855, before the deliberate raising began? Which brings me to the basements themselves. When you walk into the basement of a building constructed before 1850 in almost any North American river city, you are almost certainly standing in what was originally designed as the ground floor. The windows, where they haven't been bricked up, are at or near ceiling height now. They were designed to be at eye level. The ceiling heights are generous, consistent with living and commercial space rather than storage. The door frames are full height. The flooring, where original material survives, is finished, tile, wood, fitted stone, not the rough utilitarian surface of a space designed to be underground. These are not basements that were built as basements. They are ground floors that became basements. And the people who built them, in many cases, were still alive when it happened. This is not ancient history. The transformation of ground floor to basement in American cities occurred within living memory of the 19th century. There are letters, some in private collections, some archived at state historical societies, describing the experience of watching a familiar streetscape gradually, then suddenly, change its relationship to the buildings that lined it. Describing the decision to abandon lower floors that had become perpetually damp. Describing the strange experience of descending stairs to reach a room that had once been entered from the street. One letter, dated June 17, 1848, held in the Ohio Historical Society's manuscript collection, describes a merchant in a river-adjacent Ohio town watching water come not from the river, which is at its ordinary level, but from the ground itself, as if the earth had become saturated beyond its capacity to hold. He describes this occurring after a period he calls the wet years, a term I've found in at least a dozen other documents from the same period and region, always used without further definition, as if the writer assumed the reader would know exactly what years were meant. The wet years. Unnamed. Assumed to be understood. And then the ground floors became basements, and the cities built new streets above them, and eventually the people who remembered the wet years were gone. But here's what matters. The wet years left a physical record that the administrative record tried to normalize. In 1858, the city of Sacramento, California undertook a grade-raising project that raised street levels by up to 10 feet in the most affected areas. The official impetus was flooding. Sacramento sat in a river floodplain and had experienced catastrophic flood events in 1850, 1852, and 1853. The grade-raising was a rational engineering response to a documented flood history. But the Sacramento project reveals something that the Chicago and Portland projects obscure. Because Sacramento's flood history is well documented before the grade-raising, we can see exactly what the city looked like at original grade. And what we see is that the original ground floor level of Sacramento's earliest permanent buildings, structures built in 1849 and 1850, at the height of the gold rush, was already lower than the surrounding terrain in several sections of the city. The city was built in a depression. Not a natural geological depression. The land surveys from 1848, conducted before construction began, show relatively flat terrain. A depression that formed between 1848 and the early 1850s. A subsidence, or a sediment accumulation around the settlement's perimeter, that effectively lowered the urban core relative to its surroundings within years of the city's founding. That's not flooding. Flooding raises water levels temporarily. This was a permanent change in the physical relationship between the built environment and the surrounding landscape, occurring within years of initial construction. What caused it is not addressed in the Sacramento grade-raising documents. The documents describe the solution with careful engineering precision and decline to characterize the problem beyond recurrent inundation. That's not drainage management. That's something they didn't want to name. The part that keeps me up at night is a map. In 1869, a civil engineer named Horace Whitfield prepared a detailed topographic survey of a section of the Mississippi River Basin for the Army Corps of Engineers. The survey included elevation profiles, soil composition notes, and, unusually for a document of its type, historical elevation comparisons. Whitfield had access to survey data going back to 1810, and he used it to calculate the change in effective ground level across his survey area over the intervening 60 years. His finding, buried in a table on page 47 of a report that is held in the National Archives in College Park, Maryland, under Record Group 77, the Corps of Engineers records, was this: across a survey area covering portions of what are now 4 states, average ground level had risen by between 3 and 11 feet since 1810. Not in urban areas, where deliberate grade raising could explain it. In rural areas. In farmland. In stretches of river-adjacent terrain that had seen no construction, no deliberate infill, no administrative grade revision. 3 to 11 feet of material had been deposited across a vast rural landscape in 60 years. Deposited, not accumulated. Whitfield's language is specific on this point, noting that the deposit layer is, of substantially uniform composition, inconsistent with the varied organic accumulation you'd expect from normal agricultural land over 6 decades. Whitfield flagged this finding. He noted it was anomalous relative to expected sedimentation rates. He recommended further study. The Army Corps of Engineers filed his report. No further study appears in the Corps' records for the relevant survey area. The report has been in Record Group 77 since 1869. It has been cited, as far as I can determine, twice, once in an 1891 Engineering Journal article about Mississippi River Basin hydrology, and once in a 1934 WPA survey of historical engineering documents that listed it without commentary. Sitting in a filing cabinet in College Park. For 150 years. Describing a landscape that had risen by up to 11 feet in 6 decades, without a recorded cause. Let me connect what the ground is telling us. The rural landscape of the Mississippi Basin rose by up to 11 feet between 1810 and 1869. The urban landscapes of river-adjacent cities across the same region found their original ground floors becoming basements within the same period. The municipal responses, grade-raising projects, basement redefinition codes, new construction built deliberately higher than previous structures, cluster in the decades between 1840 and 1880. The physical and administrative record is describing the same event from 2 directions. From below, a sediment deposit of unusual composition and uniformity, covering vast areas of the continental interior to depths of several feet. From above, city after city formally acknowledging that its relationship to ground level had fundamentally changed, adapting its infrastructure accordingly, and declining in almost every case to describe the change in terms more specific than drainage, or sanitation, or flood response. Maybe the 1811 to 1812 New Madrid earthquake sequence triggered a hydrological cascade that deposited sediment across the Mississippi Basin at a scale and rate that dwarfs modern models. Maybe a series of unusually severe flood cycles in the 1820s and 1830s, the wet years that appear in letters without definition, deposited enough material across low-lying North America to effectively raise the landscape by several feet within a generation. Maybe the process was slower, more distributed, and the clustering of municipal responses in the 1840s through 1870s simply reflects the point at which the accumulated change became impossible to ignore administratively. Maybe. 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 But the front doors are underground. The basement windows are at ceiling height. The rural landscape rose 11 feet. And the administrative record describes the adaptation without naming the cause. I want to acknowledge the counterargument, because it deserves genuine engagement. The most serious objection to the pattern I'm describing is this: the 19th century was simply a period of unprecedented urban growth and infrastructure development. Cities were being built and rebuilt at a pace and scale without historical precedent. Grade changes, basement redefinitions, new construction above old, these are the expected artifacts of rapid urbanization, not evidence of an anomalous geological event. The coincidence of timing across multiple cities reflects shared urbanization pressures, not shared geological experience. This is a legitimate point. And I want to hold it seriously for a moment. But it doesn't account for Whitfield's rural survey data. Rural landscapes don't urbanize. They don't accumulate construction debris. They don't experience grade-raising projects. And yet the rural Mississippi Basin rose by 3 to 11 feet in the same period that urban basements were proliferating across the region's cities. The counterargument explains the urban pattern. It doesn't explain the rural pattern. And a complete explanation has to account for both. What I keep returning to is the silence. Not the geological silence, the sediment doesn't speak, but it's legible if you know how to read it. The human silence. The letters that describe the wet years without naming them. The engineering reports that note anomalies and recommend further study that never occurs. The municipal codes that acknowledge ground level has changed without saying what changed it. The photograph caption from 1961 that notes a front door 8 feet underground and says, "Work continued." These are not the silences of ignorance. The engineers who wrote those reports understood what they were seeing. The municipal officials who revised the grade codes understood what they were formalizing. The merchants who wrote letters about water rising from the ground understood that something unusual was happening. These are the silences of people who saw something they couldn't explain within their available frameworks, documented it minimally, adapted practically, and moved forward. Which is, in fairness, what humans do. We are remarkably good at incorporating the inexplicable into the infrastructure of daily life and declining to ask the foundational question. Your city's basement was once its first floor. The people who built those first floors watched them become basements within their lifetimes. They adapted. They built higher. They filled in the streets. They wrote the word basement into their legal codes and moved on. And the doors are still down there. Facing the dark. Waiting for someone to finally ask not just what covered them, but when, and how fast, and why the record above them is so carefully, so consistently, so resolutely silent. I don't have answers. Only patterns. And a photograph of a front door 8 feet underground, with a caption that says "Work continued," that I cannot stop thinking about.